The Galactic Federation had always prided itself on being a beacon of civilization in a universe that seemed determined to prove otherwise. For 12,000 years, they'd managed to keep the peace between species that ranged from the crystalline Axiarch, who communicated through controlled light emissions and considered verbal speech barbarically primitive, to the gas-based ethereals, whose idea of a good time involved floating through nebulae while composing mathematical poetry. It was, by any reasonable measure, an impressive achievement. Too bad the universe didn't particularly care about reasonable measure. The first reports came from the Outer Rim territories, where the Nexari mining colonies had simply stopped responding. Not unusual, really. The Nexari were notorious for getting so absorbed in their geological surveys that they'd forget to file status reports for decades. But when the automated defense satellites around their home system began broadcasting nothing but static, even the most optimistic bureaucrats in the Federation started paying attention. What they found would have been laughable if it weren't so utterly terrifying. The entire Nexari home system, 7 planets, 43 moons and a rather impressive asteroid belt that had taken them centuries to properly catalog, had been consumed, not destroyed, not conquered, not even dramatically exploded in the sort of spectacular fashion that made for good holodrama footage. Consumed. As in, completely devoured down to the last speck of cosmic dust, leaving behind nothing but empty space and a lingering sense of existential dread. The Federation's finest scientific minds immediately got to work on the problem, which is to say, they formed 17 different committees, commissioned 42 studies, and spent the next 3 months arguing about proper terminology. Were these entities cosmic consumers, stellar devourers? Really big things that eat everything? The Axiarch delegation insisted on chromatic void manifestations, because apparently even in the face of galactic extinction, they couldn't resist being pretentious about it. While the committees debated nomenclature, the entities now officially designated as Devourers by a slim majority vote continued their relentless advance through Federation space. They moved with the inexorable patience of a cosmic glacier, consuming everything in their path with what could only be described as methodical enthusiasm. Planets, stars, space stations, the occasional tourist vessel that wandered too close, it all went down the same cosmic gullet with equal indifference. The Federation's military response was, predictably, a masterpiece of bureaucratic inefficiency. The mighty Draconian Empire deployed their legendary war fleets, vessels that could crack planets and whose shields could withstand direct stellar impact. The Draconians were widely considered the galaxy's premier military force, a reputation they'd earned through centuries of successful campaigns against every conceivable threat. Their battle doctrine was elegant in its simplicity: apply overwhelming firepower until the problem ceased to exist. The Devourers ate their fleets, all of them, including the flagship Stellar Dominion, which had never lost a battle in 300 years of service. The Draconians' final transmission was a rather terse report stating that their weapons appeared to be feeding the enemy, rather than harming it. This was followed by static, then nothing. Next came the Technocratic Union, whose response was characteristically over-engineered. They deployed quantum disruption fields, reality manipulation matrices, and something called a probability cascade inverter, that none of the other species really understood, but sounded impressively dangerous. The Union scientists had calculated the Devourers' weaknesses down to 17 decimal places, and were confident their precisely calibrated assault would exploit these vulnerabilities, with mathematical certainty. The Devourers consumed their calculations along with everything else. Apparently, reality manipulation was just another form of seasoning to entities that existed outside conventional space-time. The Union's last desperate gambit, a device that could theoretically erase targets from existence itself, was absorbed so thoroughly that even the backup documentation disappeared from their archive. As species after species fell to the advancing tide of consumption, a grim truth began to dawn on the Federation's leadership. They were fundamentally unprepared for an enemy that couldn't be negotiated with, bribed, intimidated, or reasoned into submission. The Devourers didn't want territory, resources, or political concessions. They wanted everything, in the most literal sense possible, and they had the cosmic appetite to back up their ambition. The Federation's final hope lay with the Ascendants, beings who had evolved beyond physical existence, and claimed to possess power on par with the fundamental forces of the universe. Surely entities who could manipulate matter and energy at the quantum level would prove more than a match for some cosmic gluttons with an overgrown sense of entitlement. The Ascendants' attempt at communication with the Devourers lasted exactly 17 seconds. Their transcendent consciousnesses, honed over millennia of spiritual and technological evolution, were apparently just another delicacy to beings that viewed existence itself as an all-you-can-eat buffet. The galaxy's most advanced species managed one final, somewhat undignified psychic scream before joining the ever-growing menu. With their military exhausted, their scientists consumed, and their gods devoured, the Federation found itself in the rather awkward position of facing extinction without a single viable plan. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was a masterpiece of desperate improvisation, with delegates from surviving worlds offering increasingly ridiculous suggestions. The hegemony proposed surrendering preemptively, on the theory that the Devourers might appreciate the gesture and eat them more gently. The Maritime Alliance suggested hiding in the deepest ocean trenches of aquatic worlds, apparently forgetting that the Devourers had already consumed several entire water planets, without bothering to drain them first. It was during this festival of futility that the humans arrived, not with a grand fleet or impressive technology, but with a single battered ship that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, and held together with what their species optimistically called engineering tape. The vessel's representative, a scarred individual, who introduced themselves with the sort of casual confidence that suggested either supreme competence or complete delusion, requested permission to address the council. The request was so absurd that the delegates approved it, if only for the novelty. After all, what could possibly be more ridiculous than their current situation? The humans, a species so primitive they still used projectile weapons and had barely figured out faster-than-light travel, wanted to help save the galaxy. The laughter that followed was perhaps the last genuine moment of joy the galaxy would know for quite some time. The human representative waited patiently for the laughter to subside, which took considerably longer than anyone had anticipated. The ethereals were producing particularly melodious chortles that resonated through 3 dimensions simultaneously, while the Axiarch delegation's amusement manifested as rapid-fire light displays that roughly translated to adorably presumptuous prime. Even the normally stoic crystalline collective was vibrating at frequencies that suggested barely contained mirth. When the hilarity finally died down to manageable levels, the human who had introduced themselves simply as the general cleared their throat with the sort of deliberate calm that experienced negotiators recognized as either profound wisdom or dangerous insanity. They possessed the weathered appearance of someone who had seen entirely too much combat, and somehow managed to find it amusing rather than traumatic. Their uniform was a patchwork of repairs and modifications that spoke to countless battles fought with whatever equipment happened to be available at the time. Right then, the general said, apparently unbothered by the fact that they'd just been laughed at by the collected representatives of galactic civilization, "I assume you've tried the usual approach: overwhelming firepower, reality manipulation, transcendent consciousness projection, that sort of thing." The draconian delegate, one of the few survivors of their species' military disaster, bristled with indignation. "Our warfleets represented the pinnacle of military evolution. Our weapons could shatter moons. And yet here you are," the general observed with the sort of gentle courtesy that somehow managed to be more cutting than outright mockery. "Fascinating. Tell me, did any of you consider that perhaps you've been approaching this problem from the wrong angle entirely?" What followed was a tactical briefing that would have been dismissed as comedy if the circumstances weren't so dire. The general produced a collection of visual aids that appeared to have been drawn on actual paper, an archaic medium that most species considered quaint at best, and began explaining human military doctrine, with the enthusiasm of a teacher addressing particularly slow students. The fundamental problem, according to this primitive species, was that everyone had been thinking like civilized beings. They'd approached the Devourers as a military problem, requiring a military solution, using advanced technology and sophisticated tactics that assumed their enemy would respond according to conventional strategic principles. This was, the general explained with barely concealed amusement, their first mistake. "You see," they continued, gesturing toward their crude diagrams, "the Devourers aren't really an enemy in the traditional sense. They're more like a natural disaster with teeth. You don't defeat a hurricane by shooting it with energy weapons or try to negotiate with an earthquake. You adapt, you survive, and you find ways to make the disaster work against itself. The Federation delegates exchanged glances that conveyed everything from confusion to outright incredulity. The Technocratic Union's representative, their species' foremost expert on quantum warfare, raised what passed for a hand among their kind. Are you suggesting we treat entities capable of consuming entire star systems as mere weather phenomena? I'm suggesting, the general replied with the patience of someone explaining basic physics to children, that you stop thinking about this as a war, and start thinking about it as pest control on a cosmic scale. The strategy they outlined was so fundamentally ridiculous that it took several minutes for the full implications to sink in. Humans, apparently, had spent their entire evolutionary history dealing with creatures that were bigger, stronger, and more naturally equipped for violence than they were. Their response had been to develop tactics that would be considered war crimes by any civilized species: asymmetric warfare, psychological manipulation, environmental exploitation, and what they cheerfully referred to as playing dirty. The plan was elegantly simple in its absolute insanity. Rather than confronting the Devourers directly, they would use the entity's own consumption patterns against them. Human engineers working with technology that was literally held together with adhesive strips would construct what they called indigestion bombs. These devices would be designed to look like particularly appetizing star systems while containing payloads that would, in the general's words, give the cosmic gluttons the worst case of stomach upset in universal history. The Federation's military advisors immediately began explaining why this couldn't possibly work. The energy requirements alone would necessitate the output of several stellar cores. The precision timing would require calculations beyond even quantum processors. And the risk of accidentally feeding the Devourers more powerful weapons was astronomical. The plan violated every principle of advanced warfare, and ignored basic laws of physics in favor of what could only be described as optimistic improvisation. The general listened to these objections with the sort of polite attention usually reserved for children explaining why vegetables were unnecessary, then produced additional diagrams that somehow made the plan seem even more preposterous. Human forces would operate in small, highly mobile units using technology that was decades behind Federation standards. They would employ tactics that prioritized adaptability over firepower, cunning over crushing superiority, and what they termed creative problem-solving over systematic strategic doctrine. The beautiful thing about being underestimated, the general concluded with a grin that suggested they'd been enjoying this exact situation their entire career, is that nobody expects you to win, which means they never bother preparing for what happens when you do. The vote to approve human assistance was closer than it should have been, considering the alternatives involved either immediate extinction or slow, agonizing extinction. Several delegates argued that entrusting galactic survival to a species that still used chemical explosives was beneath their dignity. The counter-argument that dignity was somewhat irrelevant when facing complete annihilation eventually carried the day by a narrow margin. As the council session concluded and delegates began the grim process of coordinating with their new, impossibly primitive allies, the general was overheard making a request that perfectly encapsulated the surreal nature of their situation. They wanted detailed maps of Devourer movement patterns, complete technical specifications for all failed Federation weapons systems, and most bizarrely, a comprehensive list of every substance in the galaxy that was known to cause indigestion in carbon-based lifeform. The galaxy's last hope, it seemed, was planning to poison the cosmic apocalypse. Resolution: the Academy's emergency protocols had not been designed with actual emergencies in mind. Soft chimes continued their gentle suggestions for mindful evacuation procedures, while Ravager-cutting beams carved through the hull like angry stars. The designated harmony chambers, it turned out, were little more than meditation rooms with extra cushions, hardly suitable for withstanding beings who considered property damage a form of artistic expression. Professor Yenth stood frozen in the center of the cafeteria, his throat sac cycling through colors that had no names in any peaceful language. Around him, students performed their species' traditional panic responses with impressive dedication to cultural authenticity, but notably little practical value for survival. The human, meanwhile, had begun what appeared to be an impromptu physics lesson using cafeteria furniture. She grabbed a standard-issue meditation chair, lightweight, ergonomically perfect, and completely useless for anything requiring structural integrity, and demonstrated its surprising potential for kinetic energy transfer by reducing it to component parts in under 30 seconds. Right? She announced, addressing the terrified aliens with the same casual tone she'd used for asking about theoretical sadists. First lesson: everything is a weapon if you're sufficiently motivated. Second lesson: motivation is about to walk through that door carrying items designed specifically for ending your existence. Bloom, the butterfly-like Etherian, fluttered her wings in distress. But violence only breeds more violence. The Academy taught us that aggressive responses create karmic debt cycles. That her philosophical observation was interrupted by an explosion that removed the cafeteria's main entrance, along with most of the walls surrounding it. Through the smoking breach stomped 3 Ravagers, their cybernetic implants gleaming with hostile intent, and their weapons charging with sounds that definitely weren't covered in any harmony frequency charts. "Peacekeepers," the lead Ravager announced, his voice like metal scraping against bone. "We require your technical databases and any individuals with advanced knowledge. Cooperation will be rewarded with swift termination instead of creative alternative." Professor Yinth stepped forward, his training overriding his survival instincts in a display of courage that would have been admirable if it weren't so utterly doomed. "Welcome, displaced beings. I sense great pain in your emotional core. Perhaps we could explore the root trauma that drives your destructive." The Ravager's response was a stun blast that left the professor twitching on the floor, his throat sacs flickering weakly through the color spectrum like a broken rainbow. The aliens gasped collectively, their worldview cracking like poorly tempered glass. "Fascinating," the human observed, studying the Ravager weaponry with professional interest. "Low-yield neural disruptors, designed for incapacitation rather than immediate termination. They actually want you alive for questioning. That's tactically interesting." The lead Ravager swiveled his scarred head toward her, cybernetic eyes focusing with mechanical precision. "The flesh creature speaks of tactics. Amusing. You will provide entertainment before processing." "Oh, I'm definitely going to provide entertainment," the human agreed cheerfully. Then she turned to address the cowering students with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics to particularly slow children. Third lesson: when someone tells you their intentions, believe them. Fourth lesson: response time determines survival rates. With that, she demonstrated practical conflict resolution by grabbing a serving tray and introducing it to the nearest Ravager's facial structure at significant velocity. The result was educational in ways the Academy had never intended. The Ravager staggered backward, green blood streaming from a nose that had been forcibly relocated several centimeters to the right of its original position. His companions raised their weapons, but the human had already moved, flowing between tables with liquid efficiency while maintaining a running commentary. "Note the confusion when their initial assessment proves incorrect," she called out, using a fallen chair to vault over a plasma blast that vaporized the spot where she'd been standing. "Predators rely on predictable prey response. Deviation from expected behavioral patterns creates tactical hesitation." She landed behind the second Ravager and demonstrated the educational value of pressure points by applying her thumbs to specific locations on his neck. The result was immediate unconsciousness, proving that biology remained consistent across species when sufficient force was applied to critical neural paths. Fifth lesson, she continued, appropriating the fallen Ravager's weapon with practiced ease. Adaptation beats specialization when environmental conditions change rapidly. The remaining Ravagers had stopped treating this as entertainment. Their leader snarled commands in their guttural language while adjusting his weapon settings to more permanent configurations. Unfortunately for him, the human had apparently been paying attention to those adjustments. "Hex," she called out to the crystalline student, "what's the refractive index of your species' natural form?" What?" Hex stammered, his prismatic surface reflecting light in panicked patterns. "Light bending," the human clarified while dodging another plasma burst. "Can you focus energy beams?" Understanding dawned across Hex's faceted features. "Yes, but that would be participating in violence. It goes against everything we've learned." "Consider it applied physics," the human suggested, returning fire with appropriately non-lethal shots that nonetheless convinced the Ravagers to seek cover behind overturned tables. Education through practical demonstration. Hex positioned himself between the human and the Ravagers, his crystalline form catching and redirecting the incoming plasma beams in directions that proved highly inconvenient for their original owner. Bloom joined the impromptu lesson by using her flight capabilities for reconnaissance, calling out Ravager positions with surprising tactical accuracy. Within minutes, the cafeteria had been transformed into an interactive learning environment, where theoretical pacifism met practical necessity. Students who had never conceived of violence found themselves providing support for activities that would have horrified them an hour earlier, while the human coordinated their efforts with the casual competence of someone who had apparently been preparing for this exact scenario her entire life. The final Ravager found himself surrounded by 23 aliens, who had just discovered that survival instincts could override several centuries of cultural conditioning. He looked around at his unconscious companion, at the students whose peaceful nature had been temporarily suspended for educational purposes, and at the human who was examining his weapon with the satisfied expression of someone whose theoretical understanding had just been validated through empirical testing. "You know," she said conversationally, "your commander mentioned collecting technical knowledge. I think we've just provided a very valuable lesson in applied behavioral modification." The Ravager's cybernetic implants clicked rapidly as he processed this new information about allegedly peaceful species and their surprising capacity for creative problem-solving. His expression suggested he was beginning to understand why humans had developed such an interesting reputation throughout the galaxy. The fleet will come," he managed, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Oh, I'm counting on it," the human replied, her smile taking on a quality that made the defeated Ravager suddenly very interested in exploring career alternatives. "We've got so much more to teach them." The Ravager fleet hung in space like a collection of metallic tombstones, their commanders presumably wondering why their advance boarding party had failed to report back according to schedule. Standard Ravager protocol called for regular updates every 7 minutes, followed by immediate orbital bombardment if communication ceased. It was a simple, effective system that had served them well across 17 conquered systems. Unfortunately for the Ravagers, they had just encountered the first species in galactic history to treat their educational curriculum as a rough guideline rather than sacred doctrine. Inside the Academy, what had once been Advanced Pacifism 101 had undergone a rapid curriculum revision. The meditation circle had been replaced by what the human cheerfully called tactical positioning exercises, while the breathing techniques now focused on maintaining oxygen flow during high-stress physical activity. Professor Yinth, recovered from his involuntary demonstration of Ravager's stunning technology, watched his life's work being systematically deconstructed and rebuilt according to principles that violated everything he'd ever believed about civilized behavior. "I still don't understand," he whispered to the human as she helped Drift practice what she called aggressive negotiation postures. "How can violence lead to peace? It defies all logical frameworks." The human paused in her instruction of proper thumb placement for maximum neural disruption. "Professor, what happens when someone threatens your students?" We engage in dialogue to understand their pain," he replied automatically. "And when dialogue fails, we demonstrate superior compassion until they recognize their error. And when they start killing your students anyway." Professor Yinth's throat sacs shifted through several uncomfortable colors. We trust in the ultimate triumph of understanding over aggression." The human nodded thoughtfully. "Right. And how many of your students die while you're waiting for understanding to triumph?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, challenging every assumption that had built the Academy's foundation. Around them, alien students practiced movements that would have been unthinkable hours earlier, their peaceful natures adapting with surprising flexibility to circumstances that required more than theoretical solutions. "But if we use violence," Professor Yinth continued desperately, "don't we become like them?" "No," the human replied with surprising gentleness. "Violence to protect the innocent isn't the same as violence for pleasure. The Ravagers enjoy causing pain. We're preventing it. Motivation matters, Professor. Intent matters. Results matter." Before he could formulate a response that preserved his worldview, the Academy's external sensors detected incoming movement. The Ravager fleet was deploying assault shuttles, their sleek forms bristling with enough firepower to reduce the station to constituent atoms. The time for philosophical debate had officially expired. "Attention all students," the human announced, her voice carrying through the internal communication system with calm authority. Final examination begins now. Remember what we've learned about applied conflict resolution. Hex of the light refraction positions ready. Affirmative, came the crystalline being's response, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Though I still can't believe I'm saying that. Bloom reconnaissance patterns established. Wing positions confirmed, the Etherian replied, her earlier fluttering replaced by purposeful movement. I never thought I'd use my flight skills for anything but artistic expression. Drift are the environmental controls configured for maximum disorientation. Bioluminescent strobing patterns ready, the jellyfish being confirmed. My ancestors would be horrified at this application of natural defense mechanism. The human's tactical network had transformed the academy from a center of learning into something far more dangerous, an educational institution that had learned to defend itself. The Ravagers, accustomed to overwhelming helpless civilians, were about to receive an advanced course in the difference between pacifism and passivity. The first wave of assault shuttles docked with precision, their occupants confident in their superior firepower, and the Academy's well-documented commitment to nonviolence. They entered expecting terrified academics and found instead a carefully orchestrated lesson in practical philosophy. Hex redirected their plasma weapons into feedback loops that overloaded their targeting systems. Bloom coordinated aerial surveillance that turned their numerical advantage into navigational confusion. Drift's strobing patterns disrupted their cybernetic implants, while other students applied newly learned principles of kinetic energy transfer with academic enthusiasm. The second wave of attackers found themselves facing beings who had discovered that survival instincts could coexist with peaceful intentions. The third wave encountered students who had learned to channel their species' natural abilities toward protective rather than purely artistic purposes. By the time the Ravager commander decided to cut his losses and withdraw, the Academy had undergone a fundamental transformation. The meditation cushions remained, but they now surrounded tactical planning area. The harmony frequencies still played, but they were calibrated to mask the sounds of defensive preparations. The philosophy remained intact, but it had evolved to include practical applications of theoretical principles. Professor Yinth found himself standing in the restored cafeteria, watching his students practice what they had decided to call assertive communication technique. The human sat nearby, reviewing tactical reports with the same casual attention she had once given his lectures on theoretical pacifism. I still don't understand how this happened, he admitted. We were dedicated to nonviolence. We had centuries of peaceful tradition. The human looked up from her reports, her expression thoughtful. Professor, you were never nonviolent. You were just fortunate enough to live in a bubble where violence wasn't necessary. When that bubble popped, you discovered that peace isn't the absence of the capacity for violence. It's the choice not to use that capacity, except when absolutely required. She gestured toward the students, who were laughing as they practiced techniques that would have horrified them that morning. Look at them. They're still the same beings they were yesterday. Still dedicated to learning. Still committed to understanding. Still preferring dialogue to conflict. They've just added some practical skills to their theoretical knowledge. Professor Yinth watched Hex demonstrate light refraction techniques to a group of fascinated younger students, their applications now extending far beyond defensive necessity into realms of pure scientific curiosity. Bloom was teaching aerial reconnaissance, as an advanced form of environmental awareness. Drift had begun incorporating tactical bioluminescence into what he called interpretive communication art. So we're still pacifists? Professor Yinth asked hopefully. More than ever, the human assured him. You're just pacifists, who understand that sometimes peace requires enforcement. The Ravagers won't be bothering anyone else anytime soon, and your students learned they can defend their principles without abandoning them. As if to prove her point, the Academy's communication system chimed with an incoming message from the Galactic Council. The transmission carried news that 17 different systems had reported sudden departures of Ravager fleets, their commanders apparently having lost interest in targeting educational institutions. The humans smiled, expression that somehow managed to be both peaceful and slightly predatory. Funny how quickly word spreads about schools that teach practical philosophy. Professor Yinth found himself smiling back, his throat sacs shifting to colors he had never expected to associate with successful conflict resolution. Around, the academy hummed with the sounds of learning. Students discussing advanced tactical theory alongside traditional meditation techniques, comparing notes on applied physics and philosophical implications, debating the ethics of defensive violence with the same passionate intensity they had once reserved for purely theoretical discussions. The galaxy's premier institution of higher learning had evolved, adapting to realities that its founders had never imagined. Violence remained the failure of imagination, but imagination now included scenarios where protecting the peaceful required temporary departures from absolute pacifism. The motto still held true, it had simply expanded to encompass a broader definition of creative solution. And in a small corner of the restored cafeteria, the human who had taught an alien class to throw a punch sat quietly reading. Her presence no longer causing nervous evacuations, but rather attracting curious students, eager to learn more about the practical applications of theoretical knowledge. The galaxy's most notorious warrior species, it turned out, had always understood what the peaceful races were just now discovering. True strength lay not in the ability to cause violence, but in the wisdom to know when violence was necessary to preserve everything worth protecting.